Today we're going to be moving into our first session. The sessions are organized, if you zoomed out and looked at the entirety of the program, we're taking these in disciplinary chunks. So we go from philosophy, and then we do architecture, then we do experimentalists, then we do theology. And within each one, we've got some great thinkers giving us short presentations, and then interdisciplinary panels asking questions. So for example, the philosophers will go this morning, but then we'll have a response from an architect, an experimentalist, and a theologian within that. We regret that Michael Crosby could not be with us today, so when his name is on the roster, we're simply grateful that he is a great voice in this arena. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us. So today we have three great perspective talks. Adam PELSER, right, from Air Force Academy. Glad that you're here. We've got Brian Ballard, good to see you again, and Paul Gould giving our three talks. So introductions we're going to keep short for these panel talks. They're in the brochure and in the website for you if you want to know more, but arguably knowing about and knowing with, right, is very important. So let's just shake hands and get to know each other later in the day. So first up, Adam, thank you.
All right, thanks. All right, good morning. Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to the hosts of this conference. Thanks to the Templeton Religion Trust for funding this really important project. Thanks for having me. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I work in the philosophy of emotions. So I hope you don't mind if I talk to you about my feelings for a few minutes. I'm going to be responding to two of the perspective questions that were listed in the program. Question number 7 is aesthetic experience an instance of experiencing God? And question number 6, how does an individual's relationship with God and state of sanctification influence interpretation of aesthetic experience? So perceptual theories of emotion and perceptual theorists of emotion, of which I count myself one, defend the view that emotions are ways of perceiving value, including moral, aesthetic, and religious value. Perceptual theories of emotion find support in the writings of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, as well as biblical writers such as the New Testament authors Paul and John. Perceptual theories of emotions have been defended by many philosophers and psychologists today, including notable Christian philosophers of emotion like Robert Roberts and Linda Zagzebski. According to such thinkers, emotions, like sense perceptions, present specific features of their objects to our minds, so that it really seems to us as though the object has the feature we are perceiving through the emotion. Emotions, while not themselves judgments or beliefs on this view, often help to form and inform our beliefs about moral and other values by helping us to see those values. So this is a cognitive view of emotions. This is not a view that holds emotions and rationalities to be distinct, but rather emotions can themselves be rational. Let me unpack this perceptual analogy just a bit. Through our 5 senses, we directly experience the physical features of material objects, such as their shape, temperature, color, flavor, aroma, and sound. According to perceptual accounts of emotions, through our emotions we experience, that is, we see non-physical features of the world, such as beauty, wickedness, justice, and dignity. In short, emotions are perceptions of value. Or, as C.S. Lewis put in his book, The Abolition of Man, emotions are recognitions of objective value. Or to borrow a phrase from the Apostle Paul, emotions are the eyes of our hearts. In the emotion of fear, for example, we perceive the object of our fear as dangerous. In the emotion of admiration, we perceive the object of our admiration as excellent or worthy of special respect. Our emotions present their objects to us as being valuable or disvaluable in some particular way, and we often, though not always, trust our emotions by believing that things really are as our emotions present them to be. Contrary to popular belief, trusting our emotions in this way is not always irrational or otherwise cognitively defective. In fact, when our emotions are properly formed, they can enable direct awareness and even knowledge and understanding of objective value. In our paper, Perceiving God Through Natural Beauty, Ryan West and I argue that our aesthetic emotions like awe, admiration, and wonder can be ways of experiencing God's goodness, wisdom, and grandeur through our perception of the beauty of his creation. As William Alston puts the point in his book, Perceiving God, if God can appear to me as loving or powerful or glorious when I am not sensorially aware of a field of oats or the words of the Bible, why shouldn't he also appear to me as loving or powerful or glorious when that comes through my sense perception of the field of oats or whatever? Here I suggest that in much the same way that our emotional perceptions of natural beauty can help us to perceive God's goodness, wisdom, and grandeur, albeit indirectly and imperfectly, so too our emotional perceptions of human-created art and architecture can help us to perceive God. How might they do this? Focusing specifically on architecture for the moment, religious buildings and sacred spaces have the power to evoke a range of aesthetic and religious emotions, including awe, aesthetic admiration, wonder, and reverence. Each of these emotion types is a perception of a subtly different type of value. Whereas awe is a perception of greatness or grandeur, aesthetic admiration is a perception of beauty. Wonder is a perception of greatness beyond our grasp, which we desire to know or understand more fully. And reverence is a perception of a transcendent goodness that is worthy of worship. In addition to these rather hot aesthetic emotions, sacred spaces and buildings also sometimes evoke subtler or cooler emotions or emotion dispositions, such as peace or tranquility, solemnity, and comfort. Again, these emotion types each perceive distinct value features of their objects. Peace or tranquility involves the absence of emotions of anxiety and is a kind of perception of something like safety or security. Through solemnity, we perceive the deep seriousness of an object or situation. And through the emotion of comfort, we perceive the loving presence of another who is with us in the midst of our suffering. Of course, in many cases, the direct object of these aesthetic religious emotions is the building or the sacred space itself. We gape in awe at the intricacy and magnificence of great cathedrals, or we put away our anxieties as we rest peacefully in the familiar comfort and sacred simplicity of the country church. Through such emotions, we might not be experiencing God at all, but rather simply experiencing or perceiving the value features of the human created structures, as well as perhaps the beauty of the creative minds and rough, skilled hands that designed and built them. Even when the object of our emotional perception is not God himself, but rather some human-created structure, however, I believe that we can be in communion with God if we are perceiving the beauty with him. By way of analogy, I can experience and know my wife by perceiving her beauty, but I can also experience and know and enjoy communion with my wife when I perceive the beauty of our children with her. Sometimes, however, the emotions evoked by a sacred space or building can be directed beyond the human-created structure to God himself. How does this happen? Here it will help to consider that our emotions can be evoked by one object, but then directed toward another. Take, for example, the memorable story of David and the prophet Nathan, recounted in the book of 2 Samuel. After David had committed adultery with Bathsheba and then sent Bathsheba's husband Uriah to his death in battle, Nathan came to David and told him a story about a rich man who had many sheep and cattle and a poor man who had only one ewe lamb that he had raised along with his children and that was, quote unquote, like a daughter to him. Nathan told David that a traveler came to the rich man's house, and instead of killing one of his own many sheep to feed the traveler, the rich man took and killed the poor man's precious lamb to feed the traveler. The biblical author explains that, quote, then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. In this story, we see that rather than directly accusing David of sin, which David might have resisted emotionally by rationalizing or excusing his actions, Nathan helped David to see emotionally the wrongness of his actions in the rich man from the parable, before then redirecting David's anger toward his own sins. This phenomenon, which we might call emotional redirection, is not limited to moral emotions like David's anger. Of relevance to our symposium theme, aesthetic religious emotions that are initially evoked by sacred buildings and spaces can be redirected to God himself. When we perceive the grandeur of a great cathedral, or the simple rustic beauty of a country chapel, or rest in the tranquility of a lush prayer garden, we might initially be inclined to attribute the value we're perceiving just to the building or the space itself. But with some help from theological instruction, spiritual practices, and the prompting of the Holy Spirit, we can turn our emotional attention beyond the features of the building or space to the features of God's character which are reflected in such spaces. As magnificent as some cathedrals are, how much more magnificent is the God for the worship of whom they were constructed? As comforting as the country chapel might be, how much more comforting is the God of all comfort who comforts us in all our affliction, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians. As peaceful as the prayer garden might be, how much more peaceful is the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, that Paul describes in his letter to the Philippians. But here an important qualification is in order. What we perceive emotionally depends on what we love. Our relationship with God and our sanctification thus has a profound impact on our ability to experience God through aesthetic emotions. As Alvin Plantinga put it in his discussion of Jonathan Edwards' view of religious affections, heightened affections enable us to see more of God's beauty and glory. Being able to see more of God's beauty and glory and majesty in turn leads to heightened affections. There are certain things you won't know unless you love. Have the right affections. There are certain affections you won't have without perceiving some of God's moral qualities. So in addition to heightened affections toward God, aesthetic religious experiences will also be aided by heightened emotional sensitivity to qualities such as beauty and greatness. As Robert Roberts observes in his discussion of the emotion of awe, a sensitivity to greatness will differentiate people who look at the Winchester Cathedral, there it is, and say, "So what? Another big building. Let's get lunch," from people who gape at it in awe of the human achievement it represents. Roberts goes on to note that merely being able to distinguish great buildings from ordinary ones is not yet the emotional sensitivity that leaves one impressed by such greatness. He concludes that the emotion of awe will be possible only in persons for whom greatness matters. While I have never had the chance to visit Winchester Cathedral, I have visited St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City many times. Oh, there it is. And I have experienced firsthand the range of emotional sensitivities that Roberts describes. When my wife was diagnosed with a rare cancer a few years ago, we began visiting New York regularly for her to receive treatment at a cancer center in Midtown Manhattan. As we explored this neighborhood of New York, which is known for the Rockefeller Center, Radio City Music Hall, Saks on Fifth Avenue, high-rise buildings full of banking centers and shops where vast amounts of money are invested and spent, we were delighted to find a cathedral right in the middle of it all that is both a major tourist attraction and an active house of worship, often at the same time. On one of our first trips to New York, while my wife was in her oncology appointments, I took my daughter Naomi, who was 11 years old at the time, to St. Patrick's, and we each lit a candle and prayed for my wife's healing. It became our custom to visit St. Patrick's at least once during each of our trips to New York to spend a few minutes of quiet reflection and prayer. I often was struck by the juxtaposition of the few parishioners who knelt in the pews for prayer or who joined the choir in singing hymns during Mass, while hundreds of tourists lined the entryway and the aisles carrying their shopping bags from Abercrombie & Fitch or the Lego store. While the tourists were generally respectful, there is a noticeable difference in emotion and behavior between those who see St. Patrick's as an architecturally magnificent building, those who also perceive it to be a sacred house of worship, and those who are just thinking about which restaurant or food stand to go to for lunch. I admit that I have, on different occasions, been all three. Indeed, the sacredness of sacred spaces and the holiness, beauty, majesty, comfort, and peace of the God who meets us in those spaces will only be emotionally perceived by those for whom those qualities matter. As Jesus taught, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Fortunately, God in his grace is continuously working to soften and form our hearts, helping us to develop sensitivities to beauty, truth, goodness, grandeur, holiness, righteousness, and ultimately to his loving presence. I now conclude with a brief comment about the experimental aspect of this symposium's theme. As Robert's example of the different attitudes toward Winchester Cathedral and my own experience of St. Patrick's Cathedral suggests, there are certain behavioral manifestations of emotional attitudes or speech that we might look for in our attempt to empirically observe the ways in which architecture and space can facilitate religious experience. In his book, Emotional Experience and Religious Understanding, Mark Wynne observes that there are evidently certain gestures that are typical of prayer or other forms of attentiveness to God. It is no coincidence that slouching on a couch, for example, is not a posture associated with mental directness to God. So in this way, too, we could make sense of the thought that even in religious contexts, emotional feelings achieve their intentionality, at least in part, by a disposition of the body. I suggest that by identifying the characteristic types of body posture and speech that reveal aesthetic religious emotions, in addition to perhaps their neurological correlates, we might be able to observe whether and how effectively sacred buildings and spaces facilitate emotional perceptual experiences of God. But again, we should only expect to find such emotional perceptions in those who have eyes to see. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Adam. Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I know you're a very smart man. And I may ask every presenter here to do this. We are in a crossed language group here, right? So sometimes our language of philosophers don't cross to theologians, don't cross to architects, don't cross to experimentalists. So I might ask our presenters today to do this. In 1 to 2 sentences, what would you want an architect to take away or a theologian to take away from your thoughts here?
I think that we should think about how the spaces that we create enable us to see past those spaces and to meet with God himself. I think that's the goal.
Great.
And I think that one of the ways in which we can do that is through our emotions. And so I think that we should think about how we can create spaces that evoke the kinds of emotions. They don't have to be grandiose, mystical, sort of ineffable emotions. It could be simply the peace or the comfort or the awe that we have in response to beauty, and then find ways to direct that to God himself. And I think we can do that through a variety of types of architecture. I don't know much about architecture.
Sure,
I know very little. But I know there's lots of people in this room who know a lot more than me about that. And so I'm looking forward to learning from them about what different types of spaces can evoke those kinds of emotions and then ultimately direct them to God.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks, Matthew.
All right, we'll take a minute or two just for self-reflection, self-thought, scratch down some notes. What I don't want to do is just go talk. Just take a moment. What did this spur in your own thinking? Jot a few notes down. We'll just give you a second to self-reflect.
Okay, I am giving you a handout, but you can't make me follow it, just so we're clear on that. Seems like there's an interesting relationship between aesthetic activity and meaning making. I want to reflect with you today about the nature of that relationship. I'm going to offer you some theological, philosophical reflections, and I want to invite our experimentalists to think about how we can cook those up into hypotheses that make testable predictions, okay? When I talk about aesthetic activity, paradigmatic cases would include the poet lingering over his choice of words, or the audience member admiring the grace of a poetic movement, where in the one case, someone's generating aesthetic value. In the other case, someone's simply appreciating aesthetic value. These are both equally aesthetic activities. But I want to guard against two misconceptions. The first is that aesthetic activity is somehow reserved for the realm of high art. This is absolutely not the case. Laborers singing together in a field as they work, a mother singing her child to sleep, or a congregation singing hymns together in church. All of these people are engaged in aesthetic activity, no less than a soprano singing an aria to close out the show. The second misconception is this. Aesthetic activity need not strictly engage with the built environment or the artifactual world of human beings. A hiker admiring the flight of a hawk overhead is involved in an aesthetic activity. Okay, that being said, it does seem that aesthetic activities create meaning for us. They make life more meaningful. Milton's life is more meaningful for having written Paradise Lost. My life is more meaningful for getting to read it. I focus on aesthetic activity rather than aesthetic experience. I'm not trying to be subversive, but I want to invite us to consider whether the project of XTA is better framed in terms of aesthetic activity. Those activities I'm describing engage us totally as agents. The concept of an experience, I think, is an element of an activity, but doesn't capture the active role that we play, the way that we use art, the way that we actively engage with these aesthetic values in our world. This is particularly relevant in a religious context where where religious art is being used, taken up in quite deliberate ways in the spiritual practice of the believer. Okay, what is meaning in life? I'm not going to give you a theory of meaning in life because then you would just fight me about that theory. So instead, let's just rely on some plausible judgments that many people make and that most of us will probably share. How about that? Okay, paradigmatic instances of a meaningful life would be a devoted parent raising wonderful children, or an activist fighting to save some vast region of the Amazon, or indeed an artist laboring over his masterpiece. Okay, paradigmatic instances of Lives that are not meaningful would be someone who just wants to sit around smoking pot all day and memorizing the phone book, yeah? Or a serial killer who's enjoys remembering his murders in the presence of his trophies. These would be not meaningful lives. Okay, now that's a value judgment. I want to invite you to make that value judgment as a human being, because I know my friends with more of a science background might be inclined to think, well, I can't really judge that because I'm a scientist. Yes, but you're also a human being, and as a human being, you can see that that's just right. Those are not meaningful lives, even if those people find those lives meaningful. And that's a comment I want to make. There's a body of literature in psychology about meaning in life. Okay, there's a body of literature in philosophy about meaning in life. And when I read the psychologists, I find a lot to admire there and a lot of value. But one thing I notice, I'm talking about, for example, Roy Baumeister's book, The Meanings of Lives. It's pretty clear he's not actually talking about what a meaningful life is. He's talking about what it is to find your life meaningful. And that is not the same thing, because you can find your life meaningful though it is not, as the case of the serial killer, I think, shows us. Okay. All right, so let's think about this. How do aesthetic activities tend to generate meaning in life? Well, here are three plausible sources of meaning in life. One is relationships. Most of us find the idea of a life lived alone and unloved to be, it doesn't sound particularly appealing or particularly meaningful. Relationships are a source of great meaning in life. The second source of meaning in life is being able to make sense of your life as a narrative, being able to make sense of what you're doing, of your activities in narrative terms. A lot of people have this idea. I think that's right. I won't defend it here. I'll just offer it to you. A third source of meaning is engaging with things, doing things that matter, right? And the more they matter, the more meaning they generate for us. Okay. All right. So there's three buckets. And now here's what I want to suggest to you. If Abrahamic theism is true, certainly if Christianity is true, because of those three buckets, in each of those areas, aesthetic activity generates significantly more meaning for us. And it does so in interestingly different ways. So if Christianity is true, it's going to make a difference to how those sources of meaning generate meaning for us. And this, much of what I say, again, I think will apply to Abrahamic theisms more generally. Okay, I'm not going to be talking about the incarnation of the atonement here. So, okay. All right, so let's talk. I'm going to talk briefly about the first and second bucket, and I really want to camp out on the third bucket, okay, doing things that matter. Let's talk about the relationship bucket. So my thought here is that if Christianity is true, then your aesthetic activities are taken up into a dynamic relationship with God. For example, by using your God-given capacities well in the pursuit of aesthetic goods, you're honoring God. And that would be a dimension of meaning that would be introduced by something like the Christian God existing. Okay. Many theologians in the house will be eager to suggest that by appreciating beauty, we can somehow more richly or fully encounter God. And if that's the case, that's another thing that would go in this bucket where engaging in aesthetic activity gets taken up in this relational dynamic. Okay, there's probably other things that we can put in that bucket, but I think you get the idea. I would encourage you to, what else could go in that category? I would encourage you to think about that for yourself. Here's the second bucket, narrative sense making. How is this enhanced or augmented if something like Christianity is true? Well, you have this whole cosmic narrative into which you can embed or locate your aesthetic activities to make sense of them. And I'm thinking of particular doctrines like the idea of humanity's lordship over creation. Okay, and if that's right, I mean, so in Psalm 8, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and yet you have crowned him with glory and honor. The word for crown there is the very same word you would use at a king's coronation. So this is literally the thought of the biblical authors, is that human beings are sort of co-regents with God over the cosmos. Okay, so venerable Abrahamic doctrine. If that's right, then aesthetic activity that transforms God's materials is a way of exercising that lordship. And so that would be a sort of narrative context into which you can embed your aesthetic activities that would help you make sense of what you're doing. All right, so a lot of other things we could put in that bucket too. But let's move on to the third bucket. Okay. This is the bucket that you get meaning by doing things that matter. And now what I want to suggest is everything matters more if God exists. And I want to tell you why I think that's the case. But to tell you that, we're going to read a passage from Frederick Douglass. That is, I think, quite a lovely passage. Does someone have a handout I could borrow? Yes, okay, very good, thank you. I'm too generous. Okay. Here's Douglass. This is in his autobiography. He's encountered the violin of the great musician Paganini, and he's in awe over this violin, thinking of its history with this great musician. And it leads him to this general reflection about this special kind of value that a lot of different objects seem to have. So here's Douglass. There are some things and places made sacred by their uses and by the events with which they are associated, especially those which have in any measure changed the current of human taste, thought, and life, or which have revealed new powers and triumphs of the human soul. The pen with which Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, the sword worn by Washington through the War of the Revolution, though of the same material and form of other pens and swords, have an individual character and stir in the minds of men peculiar sensations. Okay. Douglass is putting his finger on a special type of value, a way that some things matter in our world. They matter not because of their intrinsic features, but because of their historically contingent connections to things of significance outside of them, persons and events. Okay. And once you get this category, you can see, oh, there's a lot of things in your life that matter like this. If you have children, you probably have a box full of things from their first year of life, no? And all of these things matter to you in exactly this way. You don't just have a box of any old random kid's things from the first year of his life. And if you do, don't tell me. This type of value I'm calling bestowed worth, okay? Because the crucial feature of this value is that worth is bestowed from an external entity of significance upon some object that's suitably related to it. Okay, so bestowed worth. I get that language from Nick Wolterstorff, the great philosopher. Okay, so Frederick Douglass is the very first person that I can find who has explicitly observed the nature of bestowed worth. Okay, though I'm sure we could find some similar reflections if we look in the ancient literature about relics. Okay, in the ancient practice of relics, which you find not just in Christianity, but in hero cults of ancient Greece and Rome, and indeed in Buddhism, there's a very robust relic tradition. It's obviously the same kind of value, okay? All right, here's the thing. If God exists, he stands in a bunch of relationships to the world that would plausibly be sources of bestowed worth for the world and its various furnishings, okay? And since God would be like the most illustrious person of all, he would presumably be an exceedingly potent source of this bestowed worth. Okay. So if you have a sketch on your wall, imagine it's been in your family for decades and you've long admired it. And then you discover one day, this is actually a lost page from Leonardo's notebooks. Now you would be in awe of this sketch in a brand new way. And that's because of the greatness of Leonardo. Okay, well, God is the most illustrious artist of all. So if God made the world, then all the more the world, down to the final photon, should gain tremendous bestowed worth as a result. And you could lift a stone from the earth and say, here is something made by God. But making is not the only worth-bestowing relation God stands. And I think there's actually at least a dozen. And a shameless plug, I'm writing a book that's systematically trying to chart some of these relations, okay? That's called The World as Relic. But here's a few more. So creating is one. Loving. I think the thought that God values his creation, that the sparrow on the branch before you is, as Lewis put it, an ingredient in the divine happiness. This gives me a new way of valuing the sparrow that I am looking at. Okay, I have a few others listed there, but I didn't give you them all because I want to keep the mystery alive. So, okay. All right, so how's this relevant to aesthetic activity? Well, guess what? Here you are, an artist. You've got your pigments. You're going to crush them up and mix up your pigments. Those materials are God's materials. He loves those materials. He made them. And so you're reworking materials that turn out to matter in this profound way that you didn't realize. Okay, so you guys know who Bob Taylor is of Taylor Guitars? Yes, anyone? Famous guitar maker. I happen to possess a huge stockpile of mahogany from Bob Taylor's private mahogany reserve. Don't ask me how. I'm a very bad woodworker. So, but I have this, as I sand the mahogany to reveal its grain and cut it to make whatever I'm making, I get to have this thought, this is Bob Taylor's mahogany, right? Okay, but here's the thing. All mahogany is God's mahogany. Any wood that you're sanding, you're working over God's materials. And that seems to add a whole new dimension of meaning to our aesthetic activities. Okay, here's another one. In any aesthetic activity, whether you're appreciating or generating aesthetic value, you're using capacities, reason, imagination, creativity. Those capacities are gifts from God. They're things that he loves. They're things that he made. And so the capacities themselves would bear tremendous bestowed worth on account of their connection with God. And so you're using these more glorious instruments, okay? This would be like getting to sit down at Shakespeare's desk to write your book, yes? And it seems like aesthetic activity would be more meaningful if you get to use instruments that are of greater significance, and all of your capacities for making aesthetic value or appreciating it, this would apply to them. Be like getting to use Leonardo's paintbrushes to paint something. I wouldn't want to do that, but if somehow you could talk yourself into doing that. Okay. So those are a couple of ways in which God making everything matter more by infusing it with this tremendous bestowed worth would make aesthetic activity far more potent as a source of meaning for us. There are a number of other ways. I've listed a bunch of them. I won't go through all of them, but I think one worth bestowing relation between God and world is the world resembling God in striking respects. To be God-like is to receive some bestowed worth. Well, as you create aesthetic value, you become more God-like in a certain striking respect, because God is the ultimate creator of not only aesthetic value, but all value. As you appreciate aesthetic value, you become more God-like, because God is the ultimate appreciator of all good things. Okay, so these would be just a couple of more ways in which aesthetic activity would take on new dimensions of meaningfulness within a theistic cosmos. Okay, and that's what I have for you today. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And you know what's coming, or you're better prepared.
What is this?
What the question? If we had to summarize this in 1 to 2 sentences for architects or experimentalists,
yeah,
how would you encapsulate it?
I would say, if God exists, everything matters more, including the things you're doing when you're engaged in aesthetic activities. And because those things matter more, they create more meaning for your life. Isn't that interesting?
Fantastic. Thank you. Our last short discussion today is from Paul Gould, who will be looking at making radiant aesthetic experience in the sacramental universe. Paul?
All right. Okay, thank you, Adam and Brian. I feel like I've been nourished already this morning, so really good. Okay, so I'm going to just presuppose Christian theism and a particularly rich view of Christian theism that's part of the great tradition that we find ourselves in a sacramental universe, and we'll kind of see what follows from that. All right, so the first claim, we live in a sacramental universe. This claim requires unpacking to fully appreciate its significance. So let's first begin with the word universe. The universe is that which God has made. What did God make in making the universe? The answer, as articulated by philosophy and supported by theology, is that God made substances. These are fundamental and distinct from God unities, such as people, possums, potassium, poison ivy, and things like that. It's important to note as we begin that the universe is unapologetically material. It is not wholly material. After all, people and maybe other earthly creatures are body-soul composites of some kind, and angelic beings are wholly immaterial beings. Still, the world God has made is an embodied world in which the material and the spiritual, the natural and the supernatural exist together in a nice unified whole that we call the universe. What then of sacramental? In its widest sense, the word sacramental means this way. In its widest sense, the idea is that the word refers to the fact that the universe functions to mediate God's presence, to reveal God's nature and enacted plan, and then to manifest God's glory. The universe is God-bathed, or grace-infused, or to borrow Calvin's delightful phrase, the heavens and the earth are a dazzling theater of God's glory. So much for then for the idea of the sacramental universe. Then the question is, like, what is the life that we humans live within the sacramental universe? And as divine image bearers, humans are called to first receive all things from God as gift, to steward and bless, and then name all things, and finally to represent all things back to God in creaturely gratitude and praise. So in this priestly role, is one way to understand the Imago Dei language, humans are, and I love this language, the hinge of the cosmos. And the turning point in the to God, from God narratival structure of reality. In the Latin, the exodus and redditus of all of reality that comes from God and then one day will be represented back to God. In this way, humans and non-human life in the sacramental universe becomes, or can become, as Alexander Schmemann describes it, Eucharistic life. Of course, life is often not experienced as Eucharistic. Humans regularly fail to faithfully receive, steward, and care for God's good world, as we all know all too well. And the idea that the universe is sacramental is viewed by many as sort of an archaic and sort of a pre-scientific view of the world that we kind of need to discard. We now live, we are told, in a secular or disenchanted age. And so Charles Taylor, of course, has written a lot on this, talks about how in this disenchanted or secular age, belief in God has become more difficult. Unbelief is possible and things like this. But it's not just belief in God that becomes more difficult. I think our ability to see and our ability to delight and our ability to understand the world that we find ourselves in becomes more difficult as well. And this is difficult not just for the unbelievers, just as hard for us as believers. And so what is needed, and what I want to propose, is that a certain kind of re-enchantment is needed. And thankfully, this kind of re-enchantment is possible. Think of John 6:51, where it talks about how Jesus is given to us for the life of the world. And of course, that life is a sacramental life on offer for all who will see and delight and understand and then partake in this world that God has made. I'm often mindful, the theologian Norman Wurzba talks about our failure to perceive and conceive of the world correctly as a kind of idolatry. And therefore disenchantment is a kind of idolatrous perceiving. And the basic idea there is that we've reduced the world and the people within the world to the level of human appetite, and so we no longer see clearly. We no longer see things in their proper light. So we might ask then, how can we train our perceptual faculties to faithfully see God and the world? Of course, given the reality of God, it follows that God is possibly perceptually present directly to us through religious experience. Yet, given the ongoing cultural turn away from institutional religion in general and Christianity in particular, it would be helpful to identify other possible sources of re-enchantment, or this kind of sacred or sanctified kind of scene. The reality of the sacramental universe, I think, suggests other possibilities. And one possibility that I wish to explore and motivate and justify is this idea. This is my main thesis here, is that given the sacramental universe, experiences of beauty and art can play a crucial role in re-enchanting the human experience of the world by cultivating our attention, calibrating the emotions, as Adam talked about earlier, and then representing the world to us as sacred. So let's talk a little bit about motivation. How do we motivate that thesis? Let me give you 4 reasons why focusing on experiences of beauty and arts, of course, including things like architecture, is a possible source of re-enchantment. So the first reason I offer is this. Traditionally, theologians have claimed that experiences of beauty and art can function as encounters with God, encounters that prime us to see God and then all things in relation to God afresh. So I'll just kind of programmatically give you a few reasons. Secondly, art, along with aesthetic practices and experiences, are what Helen de Cruz calls cognitive technologies, cultural means of engaging the world, and I'm just going to quote from her, that allow us to control ourselves and our environment by changing how our mind engages the world. Third, art serves as a powerful source of resistance to the reductive sensibilities of our disenchanted age, and thus is valuable, as the theologian and artist Jeremy Begbie talks about, as a kind of counter pressure to the dominant drives of modernity's reductive impulses. And then finally, given the aesthetic turn that many note today, where art and aesthetic experiences play the role often traditionally ascribed to religion, it's strategically valuable, I think, in this cultural moment to understand how aesthetic experiences of beauty and art can function as signs of transcendence. In short, experiences of beauty and art can play a crucial role, especially given this sort of cultural moment that we find ourselves in with disenchantment or the secular age. It can play a pretty important role in helping us to see the world clearly and then to delight in it emotionally the way that we ought. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about justification. So we've motivated this idea. Now let me try to justify the idea that experiences of beauty and art can play a crucial role in re-enchanting humans. So consider two theses that I just want to float to you this morning here that highlight, I think, the tight connection between art and making and beauty and the sacred. The first is this thesis that I'll call the entanglement thesis. As it reads, the activity of art is a sign-making activity. The product of artistic activity is a sign, and the thing signified by the sign is sacred. So like the animals, humans can smell and enjoy a rose, but only humans, as artists, as sign makers, can make a signum of the rose. And using the rose as a symbol that communicates, for example, love to another. Moreover, these signs, given a theological conception of the world as sacramental, are signs of transcendence, given the fact that all things, including the things that we make of the world, point in one way or another to the sacred order. Thus, art is inherently, even if implicitly, religious. So, for example, the Catholic artist David Jones, he says this in his essay, Art and Sacrament. He says, man is unavoidably a sacramentalist. He says his works are sacramental. All of his works are sacramental in character. So all of that's well and good, I think. However, these signs, if we in fact are engaging in sign making and these artistic activities we engage in, all that's well and good, but signs can be missed and signs can be misread. They often need interpreting and we need help. And that's where the second thesis, I think, can help. And I'm going to call that the radiant thesis. And this is a claim about beauty itself. So given beauty's radiant, distributional, and transcendent qualities, experiences of beauty and art can help us with two things: attracting our attention and then aiding our understanding. So taken together, the entanglement and radiant thesis can help us properly see and understand the sacred order signified by artworks. Okay, last question then. How exactly can aesthetic experiences of beauty and art play a crucial role in cultivating attention, calibrating the emotions, and representing the world as sacred? So let's begin with the idea of cultivating our attention and the idea of aesthetic perception, or the apprehension of beauty in art, and how that can cultivate our attention through the phenomena of radiance and distribution. The radiant qualities of beauty highlight the idea that beauty is both attractive and defamiliarizing. Beauty demands our attention. These are things that I think we're all aware of in our own experiences with beauty. It draws us into its orbit, attracting our focus and directing our minds. I love how Roger Scruton, he describes the attractive feature of beauty in personal terms. He says it speaks to us directly like the voice of an intimate friend. Beauty's radiance also helps us see clearly, impressing on us what Helen de Cruz calls firstness, a kind of defamiliarization brought about by an unusual or extraordinary object or person, such that we encounter the object or person as if we are seeing it for the first time. And then distribution occurs, according to Elaine Scarry, when the attention demanded by aesthetic perception of the extraordinary is voluntarily extended to objects and persons in cases of ordinary experience as well. I love Ellen Scarry. She says that in perceiving beauty in art, it serves as a kind of wake-up call. This is her language, a wake-up call to perception. And it encourages within us a rigorous standard of perceptual care, to begin to see not just the things that are beautiful in art, but to see all of reality and all of life as valuable. So this radiant and distributional pressure of beauty functions, let me skip here. While the transcendent quality of beauty plays a more prominent role in calibrating our emotions and representing the world as sacred, it can also help, I think, in this area of cultivating attention. Consider the deepest longing of the human heart, the longing for God. While every human, according to Christian theology, has this longing, many remain unaware of it. If experiences of beauty awaken the longing for God, as Christian theologians and philosophers have argued, then such experiences can play a role in cultivating our attention by directing our minds to contemplate the nature and the phenomenology of the longing, and then by directing our lives to embark on a kind of quest to encounter that transcendent object of the longing. So we don't just apprehend beauty, we also, of course, enjoy beauty, to kind of return to some of the things that Adam was talking about earlier with emotions. Aesthetic experiences of beauty, of art, evoke experiences of awe, reverence, and delight. These are some of the positive affects of positive experiences. And these are, of course, epistemic attitudes. They're encounters with the weightiness. Think of awe, this encounter with the weightiness of something. And then it's this invitation to kind of expand our souls to fit in this new weightiness of the object perceived. And so that's why they're called epistemic emotions. And so they attune us to the value of things. First, the value of the beauty of the work of art, and then by distribution to the value of all things within the sacramental universe. Moreover, given the transcendent quality of beauty, such experiences acquaint us with and alert us to the transcendent source of all value, that is God. And then finally, as a result, all things are represented to us afresh as sacred. The experience of beauty is radiant, distributional, and transcendent. The activity and the product of art making and the sacred are inescapably entangled. Thus, experiences of beauty and art provide a fitting antidote, I think, given the reductive and materialistic impulses of culture, to the widespread inability of many today to imagine, to see, and to experience reality as full of deep beauty, wonder, and value. And so I think that as we think about XTA, an account of aesthetic experience in conversation with experimental theological aesthetics can provide corroboration of and refinement of my thesis, and further clarify how aesthetic experiences of beauty and art can play a crucial role in cultivating attention, calibrating emotions, and then representing the world to us as sacred. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Yeah, the question of the ages.
Yes.
1 to 2 sentences. How do we talk to the vast audience here?
Yeah, so I think basically,
Very well put here in words, which is great. But
thank
maybe
you. Yeah. Yeah, I think just the importance of how we imagine ourselves, the kind of world that we imagine we find ourselves a part of, is really important to how we see and delight and experience and then understand that world. So our posture matters, that we would have a posture not of a mastering nature, but of really receiving the givenness of the world. And then the kind of story that we imagined ourselves a part of, to kind of connect to what Brian was saying, I think is super important as we think about how we experience the world.
Beautiful. So, good. At this point, could I ask our speakers and our panelists to come sit? And we'll invite up 5-minute questionings from our respondents. All right. Sam, since you're closest, would you like to start with your response?
Sure. So what am I supposed to do?
Yep. You want to grab your microphone? Okay, there we go. In response, or any questions that emerged from your mind, things that we could stir the conversation, things you can stir with the folks?
Yeah, no. So thinking through these your presentations, which I greatly enjoyed, and I don't absolutely. I was realizing I was processing through what you were saying. I was like, well, gosh, I don't want to sound. I don't want to go, full Hegelian, because if there's one thing a philosopher should be, it's not a Hegelian. It's that's just a person in general, should it be? But like looking at the 3 presentations, very much thinking through the first one was very much an idea of the way in which one can see the world, right? The way in which emotions can be attuned to giving meaning. With the second one saying that meaning seems to be intrinsically put through or placed continually into the world, right? Which makes sense, right? God is continually giving meaning to something, which I greatly enjoyed that concept. And it seems that his continual existence would be perpetually contriving that meaning in some way, right? In the same way that, like, if you've ever been to like an estate sale, you're going through what just seems like jewelry to you, but like when the people who were alive, those were first dates and different types of things, and now they're just kind of relics of what has gone in the past. And then and the third presentation seemed to indicate that there is a mode in which those two should unite. There's a way in which I can see the world that gives meaning. There is meaning in the world to be seen, and therefore there's a way in which I should be attuned to the world in which I properly perceive that. And so I can see a synthesis move there. It made me think of something I mentioned to my students in class, right? Like I have a second grader, and no one goes to a second grade presentation, like a second grade play or something, because they're a fan of the theater. Like no one is like, oh no, I don't have any connection to any child here. I just really love plays. Like that doesn't happen. But the value of that second grade presentation or that play is not necessarily in the aesthetic quality of the children singing, which can be a certain type of cute, but also a certain type of uncomfortable. But also, I love my daughter very much, but I know her skill sets. But in the fact that there is a boldness and a brightness that comes from the child in doing this difficult thing, in doing this matter of skill, and there is a proper way in which I perceive that emotionally correctly, and don't do that. And if I don't perceive that, and if someone else who is not the father when this child are not connected attempts to perceive it, they'll perceive something there differently. So I suppose one thing that I'm wondering, based on the unity here in this concept, is there a proper emotional response of knowing toward that which is in the universe? Is there a variegated set of responses that would be proper, in the sense that when my daughter's up there singing, my response to her is one, my wife's response to her may be another, our neighbor's response could be one, etc. Like, are there ones, would it be inappropriate for one to have a certain type of response? Is there a field of responses? And being that we all live in the world of meaning created by God, what do those fields of responses look like? Like, is there something that would be incorrect responses emotionally and existentially to was created? And by each of those becomes in of those questions here, because the fact is each of your papers deserved more than 5 minutes of response, and I have to throw 5 minutes into all three. That's highly unfair, and Matt
You're welcome.
That's unfortunate. But so I suppose if I'm trying to think about something to encapsulate all three, that was my initial general response or question or thought on that.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Any short response? If not, that's fine.
Yeah, so imagine an audience watching a symphony is even very astute critics and listeners of music are not all having the very same aesthetic experience, because for one, they might be tuned into different aspects of the symphony. You're listening to the wind ensemble. I'm listening to the strings. He's paying attention to the counter melody. Okay, but even if we're trained onto the very same object, any given object might instantiate a vast range of evaluative properties of good, can we say good making features? That's philosopher speak. But, and so therefore there's any given object is going to offer you a lot of different values that you can fittingly respond to with different emotions. So there's going to be, I think, an appropriate range of emotions, not always just one that's uniquely demanded. And the reason that there's going to be that appropriate range is that there's going to be a range of evaluative properties instantiated by any given object before us. And that's true of a symphony. It's true of a human being. It's true of a scene. It's true of a great many things.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, your question reminded me of Genesis 1 and thinking about when God is done creating the universe and he sits back and he rests. And, the question is like, why did he rest? Was he tired? And that would be inappropriate. And so what is he doing in resting? And what's interesting when you look at that, he's really delighting in that which he has made. And so it reminds me, just in terms of that question, like, what is this fundamental posture? I think delight, and then even like C.S. Lewis's idea of sensucht or joy is probably one of those somewhere in there in terms of the fundamental postures toward the world. But and I do think that as we think about receiving the world and appreciating the world, that kind of a posture toward the world can, I think, be a kind of delight, a kind of joy that permeates our lives, perhaps.
I'll just say that I great job, by the way, summarizing our talks. I think I just learned more about my talk from your summary. I would say that I think there can be a range of correct, truthful apt emotional responses to art and architecture and to God himself. I think there can be incorrect emotional responses as well. And so in saying that, I think emotions can pick out true, objective, real properties of art and architecture and of God's very nature. I don't mean to suggest that there's only one right way to respond, and God in his grace takes us as we are and allows us to experience him in our limited and finite and imperfect ways. And that one of the things that I think is part of our spiritual growth and spiritual development is learning to appreciate God in new and even truer and deeper ways throughout our life, and ultimately throughout eternity with him. And so I think there will always be new and valuable ways to experience God that we can grow in. And so, yeah, there isn't just one right way, but there are definitely some wrong ways. But there isn't just one right way, and God graciously allows us to come to him with all of our imperfections and lack of sensitivity to his greatness, and loves us nonetheless.
All right, response from Philip.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Phil Talon. Appreciated all the talks. One question I have down here is, do you all agree completely with each other? I'm curious to, it seemed, I said listening, yes, so always yes, and I'd be curious to hear if there's some things where you go, actually, I would nuance what you said, or I'd kind of push back here. It seems like unobjectionably, you all are pushing in the right direction against the sort of flattened, instrumental, sort of consumeristic way that we operate in the world toward a sense of that beauty is one of the ways that we then sort of encounter the other and are decentered in an incredibly powerful way that has appropriate gestures given sort of each situation that we're in. I think my question would be sort of very much along the same lines, which is, I'd love to hear more about some examples where, as it were, different gestures are appropriate. Or the question I had down here for under Brian's paper is, I agree that when we throw God into the equation, it raises the stakes for everything we do here. Everything matters more. And so my question is, okay, but of all the things that matter more, are there some things that matter more than other things that also matter more? Because I think that as we start to think into a sacramental frame of mind, across the tradition, there would be different answers to that question. Okay, yes, but one finds the sort of this intensification of meaning within the sacred space and sacred life of the church or the Eucharist, in a way that you might still be able to recognize beauty and sacredness out in the natural world, but there's a distinction, and this is really the place where we're kind of re-entering temple or Eden or some such thing as that. And so I think it touches on, as it were, architectural questions, which is that I've had to, throughout my ecclesiastical life, sort of work some sense with the grain of the spaces that I'm in, and sometimes kind of against the grain, to see the beauty of a elementary school cafeteria, where we're setting up chairs and taking them down, as being this beautiful place where a community of people are called to do something which is not in a beautiful space, where the meaning actually that we find, we have to kind of see against what would seem to be on the surface, much in the same way that when we're working with those who are in great need or who are difficult, we can sort of see Jesus in them, and this counting as service to Christ, not naturally, but actually sort of against what the experience might be, because Jesus himself told us to. And so I'm kind of trying to think about, sort of as we make decisions about the sorts of aesthetic experiences we pursue, the ways that we would attempt to construct and sort of fight against disenchantment. Are there examples that you thought of including, but were not able to include in your very short presentation of, like, okay, here are some suggested ways of encountering God through aesthetic experiences that you think are really commendable. People should do this. I do think this comes up in say, architectural decisions. I've been part of many church building projects where the beauty of expediency and pragmatism, which we all experienced in the elementary school cafeteria, then is able to still sit in the saddle as we make further decisions. And artists and the other people who are trained in design are not included in sort of helping to then sort of shape the worship space, for instance. And so there's a tension sometimes between how we make decisions. You can acknowledge there's a beauty here in this very humble circumstance, but we don't have to always continue to that. We should kind of make wise decisions as we construct spaces that then help people to have those appropriate postures as they encounter design spaces or some such thing as that. I have a couple of questions, and it's connected to this, a question for Paul specifically, which is been in my head, bulwarks of belief. You know, we have this old model. You have like a sacred social order, and you've got a cosmos, and you've got porous versus buffered selves. And I've been working on trying to think through, okay, how would I re-enchant the world, but without taking on a sort of naive perspective of the universe? How does this actually make sense? One of the ways that it seems like some account of the great chain of being, sort of, it would be part of that. I still think there's a lot of validity there. That also involves, as it were, hierarchy, some things being more valuable than others, like more worthy of our attention and so forth. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more about particular works of art that are especially helpful for combating disenchantment. When I look at the work of the Inklings, for instance, Lewis is like, okay, here I'm going to give you sort of an account of the cosmos that's merged with his theology. So instead of planetary forces, it's angels, but they still seem to have these influences on humans. Or Tolkien's trying to give an account of a sacred social order where like kings matter, and you have people, kings are mediating, as it were, providence, like through their authority. And so they're trying to construct some of these artistic artifacts that then kind of help people to re-engage with the sacramental sense of the world. And I think that I find the artifacts very often more helpful than the theory for enabling me to experience re-enchantment. So I'm curious to hear about just some particular works that you find useful for this purpose. So thank you all very much.
In second time, maybe I'll just have Paul give a quick response since he was questioned last.
Yeah, there are a couple things you said that one, there's a tension. You asked that question, like, of all the things that matter more because of God, which one of those matter more? And there's tension in my heart right now as I'm thinking through, because on one hand, I want to say things like everything is intrinsically valuable in virtue of being created by God, and so it's all valuable. But then on the other hand, I do see that that we need to be wise stewards of our time, and we need to live our lives well in that way. And so here's something that's been freeing, though, to that question and that tension is like, just like this prayer that I pray actually every day is like, Lord, just help me to lean in your direction. And like, there's like a lot of freedom in that, where it's like, we don't have to be perfect, but Lord, just help me over time to lean in your direction today. And then to have that prayer daily has been really freeing, I think, in that, in terms of seeing the sacredness of all things, but still stewarding our lives wisely. To your second question about the sacramental universe and hierarchy and things like that, I do think, so one of the things I'm working on is like, because I'm really interested in recapturing this sort of sacramental view of the world that we've kind of lost post-modernity, post-enlightenment. And so, but there is this question, I work primarily in metaphysics and what is the nature of reality? So there's this question, what is the ontology of the metaphysics of the sacramental universe? And that's actually what I'm working on now, is trying to think through that in a way that's responsible to the science and good thinking in metaphysics and then theology. And I do think that something like Arthur Lovejoy's Great Chain of Being is probably part of that the world is kind of structured in a way that is each individual thing does have value, but there's a kind of hierarchy of value. Think of and been kind of planning myself in Matthew 6 lately, where Jesus is encouraging us not to worry, and then he has that the look and see passage. Look at the birds of the air and how they they don't store for food, but yet they have food daily. And then he says, how much more are you valued than the bird? So there is this hierarchy of value that you see even in
Mhm.
Jesus's words. So I think that things like that will be part of it. But yeah, that's a great question. I do think that there's a way that we can develop a robust philosophy of this kind of sacramental view of the world, but to be determined.
He's going to be talking about mediating the divine, architectural hypothesis for sacred equality.
Oh, on your book, no slides, right? No. Okay. Get this out of here.